So this lawnmower was terribly neglected before I picked it up, but the transformation into something useful again has taken a really long time. And it's mainly due to having to make up for all the maintenance that it missed while with the last owner. So hopefully after this round of makeup maintenance, we'll be one step closer to getting it ready for sale. Otherwise, I'll have to put it back into storage, which is something I'd like to avoid. In today's video, we're going to be looking at this Toro lawnmower, and the problem is that the choke is not working. Now the choke is supposed to help make it possible to start the engine when it's cold, but with it not working, we have to physically prime it to start it. So does that mean it's easy to start when the engine is hot then? Nope, that's also a problem too. Like I said, there's a lot we have to fix with this one, so we might as well get started. Now I'm going to try and repair this lawnmower, but yours might be different, so this might not work on yours. So if things are not working out for you, like in the video, please ask about it, and I'll be glad to answer your questions. Now before we get too far into the repairs, we need to document all the stickers we can. That way, we'll have the information that we need just in case we have to replace some of the parts. Now in the last video, we had to open the engine up to reseal the oil sump because the gasket had broken, causing a terrible oil leak. So it's always a good idea to check and make sure that there's plenty of oil in the engine first, just to make sure that we didn't do anything wrong. Now there is about a quarter tank of fuel in it, and despite the choke not working, it is very warm today, so we might be able to start it without having to prime it with fuel. So of course I didn't show the full test run because of time, but the engine is quite warm now. However, as you can see, it's not wanting to start back up while it's hot. What this typically means is that the valve clearances need to be inspected because they might be out of tolerance and causing this problem. Now you don't need to take the recoil and the cover off the engine to do this, but this helps me to film it a whole lot easier. So if you couldn't hear it, it is lightly raining at the moment, which might limit my camera angles, so I do apologize ahead of time. Just be careful with these Kohler engines because depending upon what revision you have, they might have extra washers, spacers, or even other small parts that you'll need to watch out for. Now this one is supposed to be the better version of the airbox, but I still find it to be cumbersome to work with. So with the airbox out of the way, we can finally see how the choke system works, or in our case, doesn't work. So the problem turns out to be a missing linkage between the choke arm and the thermostat bypass. So it turns out the choke relies on the thermostat to help close the choke once the engine cools back down. Next, we're going to start the process of taking the carb off the engine by disconnecting the fuel line, but this would also be a great time to replace that old line as well. I do have to warn you that there is a fuel filter built into the outlet of the fuel tank, and it could sometimes get stuck to the fuel line as you're trying to take it off. And if you're not careful, you could damage the filter, but since I'm replacing the fuel line anyway, I'll cut the line to make it easier to remove the filter. Now luckily I was able to get this one out in one piece, but if yours does break, I'd recommend installing an inline filter just as a precaution. Otherwise, debris from the fuel tank could clog up the carb, which will make using the mower tougher as time goes by. So after spraying carb cleaner into the fuel filter, we can then move on to dealing with my least favorite carb design, which is saying quite a lot. Now the first time I saw this design, it looked very intriguing, but after seeing other designs, I've since started using other words to describe it. I think the part that I don't care for the most is this vacuum actuator bolted to the side of the carb. It's meant to bypass the choke when it senses vacuum from the engine. I mean it works, but other systems are way less complicated. Now before I open the carb, I'm going to give it a quick cleaning, that way we don't get dirt inside the carb when we take it apart. Now doing it while the carb is still intact is a whole lot safer to do than taking it apart to clean, which is what the ultrasonic cleaner is for. So after taking off the idle set screw, we'll then remove the pilot jet that was directly below it, that way we can clean it too. Now the bigger opening in it isn't the problem, but instead it's the tiny opening at the bottom of the brass part that you should be worried about cleaning. After that, we can then remove the fuel bowl to get access to the rest of the carb. Now inside the bowl wasn't terrible, however there is a spot of rust, which means there must have been water in the fuel at some point. So yes, it could just not touch it and leave it for the ultrasonic to try to clean up, but we needed to clean the hard to reach areas and not the easy spots. So we'll just give it a spray of carb cleaner, that way it won't contaminate the solution in the tank. We'll then remove the main jet and see if it might need any cleaning, and even if it doesn't, it wouldn't hurt to clean it anyway just to make sure it's as clear as possible. Now to do that, I'm going to use my carb cleaning wires, but you can use most any type of thin wire. Just be careful not to make the opening any bigger. The only reason to make the opening any bigger is for some reason you think the engine isn't getting enough fuel. So after taking out the pin, the float, and the needle, I'll then put the carb into the basket for the ultrasonic and let it run for a couple of cycles. So while the ultrasonic is cleaning these parts, we'll use this time to adjust the valve clearances. Now with the way I check the clearances, you don't need to remove the spark plug, but it does make rotating the engine a whole lot easier to do. This also gives us the chance to inspect the spark plug, and what we find is a whole lot of carbon on it, which is not good. What this means is that the engine has been burning oil, and a lot of it, either because the engine is worn out or there's a lot of blow-by from the engine. So after removing the valve cover, you'll want to rotate the engine until one of the rocker arms is loose while the other one is tight. Next, we'll take a 5/1000 of an inch feeler and see how it fits in the clearance, and surprisingly, it doesn't fit. What this means is that the clearance here is much too tight and will need to be opened up so that the feeler just barely fits in it. After that, we'll hold on to the adjusting nut while tightening the jam nut. So after double checking it, we'll then rotate the engine so that the other arm is loose while this one is tight and repeat the same process. Now I didn't show it, but the clearance on this one was much too large, so the feeler was extremely loose in the clearance. And instead of finding out where the clearance had gotten to, we'll just save time and make the adjustments. So if your engine is several years old and the clearances have never been checked and you're having trouble starting the engine hot or cold, then it might be time to inspect it because more than likely they'll be out of tolerance. So after double checking it again, we'll then replace the valve cover and its fasteners and then check on the parts in the ultrasonic. And as you can see, the parts certainly look a whole lot cleaner, but it's the areas that we can't see that I hope got cleaned as well. So I did forget to remove the emulsion tube from the carb, so I might as well take it out and at least check it. And luckily for us, it looks very clean, and more importantly, the tiny openings in it are clear as well. I'll then put the tube back into the carb and then start the process of putting the carb back together. Now, if your carb has a lot of rust or crusty buildup in it, then you might want to consider trying out an aftermarket carb instead. And yes, the aftermarket versions are typically a lot lower in quality compared to OEM, however, there are some that are quite good. And if the mower runs okay with a new carb and you're sure that the rest of the mower works like it should, then you might want to consider servicing the original carb too. Then you can take the aftermarket carb off and put it on the shelf for a rainy day or do whatever you want with it. I almost forgot, we need to put the pilot jet back in along with the screw for the idle. So be very careful how you install the screw, because if you don't put it back the same way, the engine might be running too slow or too fast. The last part we need to install on the carb is the vacuum actuator, and also don't forget to connect the vacuum line to the carb. Now because it's such an unusual design, the likelihood that you'll forget is quite high. In fact, it's happened to me at least once. Now before we install the carb, I do have to remember to replace the fuel line that we cut up earlier. The fuel line that came from the factory doesn't seem to age very well, but I think it mostly has to do with the fuel. Then we can finally install the carb on the studs and then connect the governor linkage, return spring, and the new fuel line. So one of the only redeeming features about this engine is the ability to take the carb off without having to remove a stud. So on a lot of engines that resemble this one, to have enough room to take the carb off, a stud has to come off first. Now we still have to replace that missing linkage on the thermostat, but I have an idea on how to fix it without having to order a new part. So first off, I'll install the bracket for the arm, and then it should be pretty clear how I'm going to get around this problem. Now I know the linkage is only $7, but you'll have to wait a day or two to get it when instead we can get it working right now. What I'm going to do is get a metal coat hanger and use part of it to replace the linkage. I'll just try and bend it to look like the original piece and then test it to make sure that it works the same way. So here's the part you're not going to like. When installing the linkage, to do it the right way, you'll need to remove the bracket again. That's because there's really no way to work the end of the linkage into the lever for the thermostat. And the reason for that is because the bracket bolts to the carb and also because of how the U-shaped end connects to the choke arm. So after the linkage has been connected on both ends, we can then replace the bracket and then move on to the airbox. Of course, you want to make sure that the linkage is working without any snags or hang-ups, otherwise you'll have to make some adjustments to the linkage. I don't recall if I mentioned it earlier, but I'm not a big fan of this particular engine, and I know that I'm not alone when I say that. They're not terrible engines, but I do have a pecking order when it comes to which engines I'd like to have on my own personal mower. I do appreciate how quiet and smooth they are, and they deliver good power, but there are other engines out there that do it better. Now, most consumers don't really care which engine is on the mower they're buying, just so long as it starts and runs year after year, which, to be honest, is the most important thing. And for most, all they do is put fuel into the tank and use it and hope that it starts in the following spring. But for this engine, I find that it's quite sensitive to not having maintenance work done to it. And even though the work for the first several years, the last couple might start to give the owners some problems. But then again, that's with most engines and not just this one. Now the fuel in my can isn't fresh, but it is 100% gasoline with no ethanol, which is not good for small engines. So it's still got a bit of a hiccup, and that's more than likely the carb or the fuel that I put into the tank. I'll have to try getting some fresh fuel from the pumps later on and try that again. Otherwise, we might have to uncover the hidden adjustment screw on the carb and make some changes. But so far, this project has gone without a hitch, and besides going through a checklist to make sure everything is in order, like getting a new air filter, it should be ready soon. However, when I was doing my test mow with it, it started to have more hiccups and it started coughing out black smoke from the muffler. And unfortunately, the reason why it's running with a hiccup is a lot more devastating than you can ever imagine. But we'll have to save that for a different video because soon after this, it started happening more often with other engines too. Don't worry, it'll make more sense later on. So my question is, if you did all this work to an engine, and we're talking about resealing the oil sump, servicing the carb, and adjusting the valves, only to have another major problem come up, would you want to give up on it? Time is money, and at this point, I'm way over my limit with this one.
Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or about your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.